Well, good morning, Facebook. My name is Nathan Magsig, and I'm a supervisor here in Fresno County. And we have a special guest today. We have Deanna Wolf, who is here to my left, and she is the executive director of Unite the Parks. And I really appreciate her being here today. I know that last week, when the media was talking about some of the information I was putting out there, and I was encouraging all the people from the mountain community to write letters about how the lawsuit against the U.S. Forest Service was impacting you, and just to share some of your stories, Deanna, to her credit, through the media, reached out and said that she wanted to sit down and have an opportunity to have a conversation with me and all of you, and that's what we're going to do today. But before we get to that conversation, I just wanted to provide a quick update on some fires that were started last week. There was one near Pine Flat, which, as of this morning, when I got an update from CAL FIRE, they shared with me that that is going through mop-up stages right now, meaning they're just tending to some hot spots. There should be some crews out there working through the rest of today to really make sure that that fire is all the way out. And then, of course, there was a fire, I believe, in Madera County, and that fire, too, was pretty active, but it's my understanding that growth has really slowed on it. At least that was the last report that I was giving, and they might be beginning mop-up out there as well, which is good. And I want to encourage all of you, if you're watching this video and you're planning on enjoying our beautiful mountains and enjoying the beautiful Sierra, as you go up and camp, follow the rules. There are certain areas where you're not allowed to have campfires, and two, just be smart about what you're doing up in the mountains, because right now conditions are so dry, a small fire can get out of hand very quickly. So let's jump right to our conversation. And again, Deanna, as the executive director of Unite the Parks, there was a lawsuit, I believe your organization filed against the U.S. Forest Service and Fish and Wildlife to protect the Pacific fisher, which is a weasel-like animal. So, Deanna, can you talk a little bit about your organization and what are some of the things that you're attempting to do?
Well, Unite the Parks is an organization that I founded, and our main purpose is to try to protect the federal land between Yosemite and Sequoia Kings Canyon, which is the Sierra National Forest, basically, and maybe the little portions of BLM land that are around that. So that's kind of the big picture of what we're trying to achieve. And in terms of the lawsuit, that's a new thing for Unite the Parks. We've never been in a lawsuit before. So a brief summary of the lawsuit and what it's about. The Pacific fisher was listed as endangered in May of 2020, so basically a year ago. When the fisher listing happens, the Forest Service sends their projects, basically a bundle of logging projects, to Fish and Wildlife. And then they have to approve it, and they issue a biological opinion. So I'm going to give you a really clipped version of this so that I can take you up to like where we are today, right? So they did this. They got kind of a rubber stamp from the Fish and Wildlife Service that said, go forth. And we basically had to get those 45 logging projects, get the documentation. That's like thousands of pages of documents. Those 45 projects are mainly in the Sierra National Forest and in the Sequoia, so there's those two that come together. And the first thing you have to do is you have to send a notice of intent to sue, which is a 60-day notice, right? And we had a huge learning curve, so we had to learn what's going on with those logging projects, fisher biology, what does this animal need? And then to try to understand how the law works. So it actually took us, we didn't get our letter sent until September because we were busily working on that. So that's like step one. And then, we got some attorneys, we got these other groups to join us. We got the John Muir Project and the Sequoia Forest Keeper to join. And we reissued another letter because the creek fire, basically the day I sent the notice of intent to sue is the day that the creek fire started. And of course that changed the dynamic entirely because you've got, in a couple months changed the dynamic, 500,000 acres burned right in Pacific fisher habitat. So then we have to write another letter. So these things keep going forward. And then the latest thing that's got your attention and has gotten a lot of people's attention is you're filing a claim, but we also filed for a preliminary injunction. And what that says is it asks the judge to halt logging until conditions can be reassessed, right? So there's only in that bundle, by the time we got to, I'm giving you again a very clipped version, by the time we got to the court case, we have 31 projects left. Now, why is this really significant? And then I'm going to turn it back to you. The Fisher, at last count, there was only about 250 Pacific Fisher in existence, at least in the southern Sierra Nevada portion, right? So that's not very many animals, right? That population count was done prior to the beetle kill with all the drought that happened. And at that point, 39% of Pacific Fisher habitat was altered. So this is, again, the listing happens. The population account doesn't include the situation with the beetle-killed trees. And then on top of that, right on the heels of this, you have this massive creek fire plus the Sequoia complex fire at the same time. So right in the middle of its habitat, 500,000 acres burns, and you've got now 55% of its habitat is altered. They still don't know how many Fisher there are out there. They don't really have a full understanding of what is left in terms of Fisher habitat. So you've got these two things that the suit's really about. Can you please go out there and figure out how many, assess the population and then assess conditions? Because Pacific Fishers need like a certain type of habitat, particularly old growth trees. So we then asked the judge, can you halt this logging and halt the further damage to the habitat while we figure out what's going on? And so that's where we are today. We didn't succeed in that, but I could explain more about that later, like what happened there. But that's essentially the short version of the last year. Anyway, so to you.
So looking at, and I can appreciate, I believe we need to preserve old growth trees. We need to preserve our forests. But just looking at the condition that they're in, I believe, and many others out there believe too, and I spent some time at UC Berkeley's Blodgett Forest learning about the importance of fire and the importance of making sure that we have sustainable forests out there.
Yeah.
But some would argue that, if you look at forests and how they were 200, 300 years ago when Native Americans really tended to the lands, you had, in some cases, 1/6 the amount of tree density that's there today, because lightning, I believe, actively started fires in the mountain communities, and you didn't have fire departments, so those fires would burn. And in addition to that, too, you had Native Americans that would start backfires, too, when they would come down out of the mountains during the wintertime, and those fires would burn and help to keep a lot of that underbrush out. And you mentioned that we had the drought and the bark beetle, and many of the trees have died. In Fresno County at the end of 2019, there were 25 million dead trees in Fresno County alone. And in Tulare County, there were 29 million. Yeah. And so what that creates is so much fuel load that when you do have a fire like the Creek Fire begin, it just devastates so much, and it's difficult to really try to stop fires when conditions are such that the wind's blowing and there's so much fuel and that fire moves quickly. So what I'd like to do just maybe for a moment is talk a little bit. I know some of the things in the lawsuit that was filed, you kind of indicated that logging and some forest management techniques out there actually cause fires to burn hotter or quicker. So maybe we could talk about that a little bit so I can better understand that perspective.
Yeah, so this is a really complicated topic, and so just a caveat is that we're generalizing here. There's really lengthy scientific reports, and Dr. Joseph Warren, who's our chief scientist, could really go into detail on it. So I'm just giving broad brush strokes, okay, that explain sort of what the problems are and how we, what the situation is. So we know that Yosemite and Sequoia last year, same relative topography as the Sierra National Forest and Sequoia National Forest. Those areas didn't really burn, right? So the old growth, those protected areas, those are 95% wilderness, and they're doing reasonably well, right? We have climate change, and there's not much we can do about that. Well, there probably is, but let's set that aside as a topic. But so So here we have this like real live example where these really well protected areas are doing better. And then we have these areas that have been heavily logged that are not doing very well, right? And so the question we have to ask is why is that? And then we have to explore it further. Now, there's these three elements associated with fire that we have to think about each one of them, right? So we've got ignitions, right? So 84% of fires on public lands are caused by like people going out and starting them. You know, just fire gets away from them, like the rim fire, right? So you've got that. You have to think about that. You know, the Forest Service has 5,000, between the two forests, it has 5,000 miles of roads. How are you going to manage for fires when you've got that many roads and you've got the ignition sources being, you know, us mainly, right? So that's a problem.
And so with that study about ignition sources being us, because I was always taught that really lightning starts more fires than even human beings do in the mountains. So if you look at all the lightning strikes that take place, just naturally, we are quick to go out and put those fires out. But maybe that's a study that I need to take a look at.
I'll send this to you. It's even in the Forest Service, they'll confirm that that's a big issue. So we have to look at that. And the suit doesn't look at that at all. Like there's nothing in the documentation that the Forest Service has presented that honestly evaluates the problem with roads. And I love four-wheel driving and I love dispersed camping, and I mean I really enjoy it. It's not that I want, you know, I don't want people to go out and enjoy themselves. It's just we have to think about trying to structure things so that we can get control over ignitions.
You indicated that logging is a contributor, and that like you look at Yosemite where there hasn't been logging because it's a national park, but you know, but there hasn't been logging. Share with me the logging that you're speaking of that has been a contributor, so I can better understand that.
Well, right. So the parks have the old growth forests, right? So they're in way better shape, and you know, theoretically, those old growth trees they're the least likely to burn. You know, they're huge trees, and they have, you know, a dense canopy, so it also shades and cools the forest around it. So there's a whole ecosystem that's intact there, which is not. There's patches of that in our forests, but it's not the same. The same as it was. I'm not sure whose phone that was. In case. So we really want to hold on to the old growth. So across the Sierra, there's only 12% of the original old growth in place. And so that's really precious, really, really precious trees. And we can't get the Forest Service to say they're not going to log those trees, because those trees also have a really high value for the timber industry. And so they kind of do this exchange where they say, okay, well, we're going to have you do some thinning, but you can take these, you know, these larger trees. And those are trees we just don't have very many of. Plus, the Pacific fisher, you know, the female fisher, most of her denning, like 75% of the denning is in these old living trees. And you just can't reproduce a 500-year-old tree. It just, you know, takes 500 years. So in a way, you know, our back is really up against a wall in terms of the preciousness of those trees. They're great for fire, you know, for fire resilience, but they're also really good for the fisher. So that's a super important thing, right? So, you know, you've got the fuel load conversation, and then you've got airflow, and that's the last piece that is part of the puzzle. So you've got fuel load, that's usually where the conversation happens. You've got ignitions, which there doesn't seem to be a conversation. And then this last piece, which is new, which is the way that air flows across the landscape. And this is the new thing that has to be thought about. When you make a fuel break, right, you introduce air into a region, you're drying things out. It's going to influence the direction of wind. Potentially, it could make things worse, right? So fuel breaks work if there's firefighters on them. Like if they're standing there fighting the fire, then that's effective. But if there's nobody there, it's potentially going to guide the direction that the fire goes. So, and every time we build roads, we're like punching a hole in the forest, and that again introduces airflow. And you know, like when you have a potbelly stove, everybody knows this, right? If you've got one at home, like if you want the fire to go out, you close it, right? You close the door to the potbelly stove because there's no oxygen, it's cut off. If you want to have the flames go up, you open it up. So with forestry, the problem, and they really don't understand this very well, this is like cutting edge science, is that when they're pulling out that understory brush, they're pulling out those trees, they're also introducing airflow and oxygen, and that is potentially making things worse.
And I got to push back a little bit, because I do, like with a potbelly stove, I can understand when you shut that door and you crack it open, you limit fuel flow. But when you think about our forest, you have to think three-dimensionally as well.
Yeah.
So while you punch a road in this way, you always have everything. And with a fire too, when a fire starts, it doesn't just rely on wind blowing across it. A fire at some point actually sucks and creates a vacuum.
That's right.
And if you look at the creek fire, one of the things that happened with it, which I don't think had ever been seen before, the fire expanded 50,000 acres in 24 hours. That fire jumped the San Joaquin River, which I don't believe any other fire ever has jumped the San Joaquin River in recorded history. And then two, looking at, I think even you mentioned a little bit, the pyrocumulus cloud, which formed because of it. So that pyrocumulus cloud, which went up tens of thousands of feet, there was so much energy from that fire, that cloud froze and actually collapsed on itself, which was like an explosion. And blowing that fire everywhere. But there were fire tornadoes that literally ripped trees out of the ground. And so there comes a point where where a fire gets hot enough that it's not just relying on the wind. It actually sucks the wind, or creates its own weather, but it's pulling air into it.
That's right.
And when you have fuel loads like what we saw in the creek fire, you get fire behavior that you've never really seen before. And I know that Cal Fire did a not a documentary, but a thing on YouTube talking about how fire breaks at Blue Canyon, other fire breaks, and how Southern California Edison had managed their lands, really helped to settle that fire down because they had cleared so much fuel out. So I mean, I am not a fireman, but I've spent a lot of time around them. I've listened to them. Going and spending time at UC Berkeley and listening to what the experts who run Blodgett Forest have shared with me about the importance of fire and keeping, having a healthy forest and making sure that it's thinned appropriately. That was very interesting for me to hear about. And then hearing from John Mount, who is a forester who's been, in the mountains trying to thin the forest. To me, that's been very important. But one of the things that you shared, I will share with you, I too am concerned about our old growth trees that we have and protecting them. I too am concerned about the habitat that we have and preserving it. But there's a term I use frequently. Stewardship to me means that there's a balance, there's a human component to this. And as a steward, I need to make sure that the resources we have, our forests, are kept in a way that are sustainable long term. And from what I've seen in my own district, our forests have become so densely covered in trees that when those trees got stressed, bark beetle came in and, of course, proliferated the entire area and killed a lot of trees. And then the fires came thereafter. So just my perspective is a little bit different than I think your perspective, but our goals, I would say, are the same in some areas, preserving the larger trees.
Right, and we don't nobody wants to have another creek fire. I mean, it was terrible. I mean, you go out there, I mean, I spent so many days and nights out camping, and I'm used to going and seeing this like cradle of trees, and it's just been, you had the French fire and the Aspen fire, which already, devastated a big portion of that area that I used to go and camp, and I still camp, but not happily, and then you have the creek fire sweep through, and it's like Armageddon out there. There's just sticks and just dirt, and so no one wants that, right? And so that's the question, and that's the question that we're trying to introduce, like a complete picture of those three elements that have to be evaluated so that we can make decisions. Because, as you said, a big fire like that creates its own weather system, and at that point, all bets are off. Like it potentially doesn't matter what you've done. Like it's out of control, right? It was so big that they just couldn't control it. So the questions on the table are like, how effective are fuel breaks? Are they making it worse? Are they making it better? Can they be designed more thoughtfully so that, you're not, there's like prevailing wind conditions, for example, like that has to be thought about. So fortunately, Dr. Wern is a physicist and his specialty is airflow. And so he actually understands how these dynamics work. And right now he's trying to get a bunch of the premier scientists, fire scientists, forestry people, biologists all together to come up with a tool that enables land managers to make smarter choices that consider all of these variables when they're managing an area. And so that's the goal. I mean, it might take time for them to develop that tool, but in the meantime, we have what we have. And I mean, I'm really worried about this summer. I mean, I think the forest supervisor should not let dispersed campfires happen right now. I think he needs to, like Sequoia and Inyo have already said, like, hey, you can have campfires in an official campground, but having a dispersed fire, you can't do that. And again, I love dispersed camping and I like to have my own fires, but right now the situation's already super dry. We had the 2 fires that you mentioned, and I'm just like, it's June, right? It's June 1 and there's already 2 fires. What is it going to be like in August, in September, October? Like, we usually don't get rain until November. I mean, I'm just really, really worried. And I think if you have all these followers out there, I don't know if you can get volunteers together to work on a way to somehow protect the forest, but
so you mentioned earlier, so I do have a lot of followers. I've got people who watch this that actually are part of 4-wheel drive clubs.
Yes.
I was a part of a 4-wheel drive club before, and I have a video I would encourage you to watch.
I saw it.
Where they actually go out and help to keep keep some of the pathways clear, cleaning up some of the pathways. And to me, I really appreciate the 4-wheel drive clubs and some of the other organizations that do organized hikes with people to clean up our trails, remove the garbage out of the forest. And what I mean by that is there are some people who camp and just leave their stuff behind, and that is, to me, that is very terrible. That is not being a good steward. But I know that this is our first time meeting, and there's so much ground I think that needs to be covered, and I want to share with all of you guys that are watching right now. Some of you are very frustrated. I'm frustrated. Some of you are looking at this and you're perplexed, but I want to say this. One of the things that's lacking, in my opinion, in our country right now is an opportunity where we have individuals who may see things from different perspectives, even if they're 180 degrees apart, to sit down and just talk about the perspectives that they have. And so when Deanna, through my office, had a conversation and was willing to come to my office to talk about these things, I give her a lot of credit, and I thank her for just sharing her perspective, even though a lot of it I don't necessarily agree with, but it helps me better understand where she's coming from. And so what I want to do in just the last few moments that we have is maybe talk a little bit about
the meter is up.
Okay. So we're going to make this real quick. Let's talk a little bit about just the lawsuit. I know that there was an injunction that the judge was going to rule on, and there was a ruling on Friday. What happened on Friday?
Well, we got a note at 5:30 on Friday from the judge that said, and I actually brought you a copy if you want to read. It's worth reading because a lot of the things that we're discussing are in there, and some of the issues that are murky are in there as well. But he basically denied our preliminary injunction, and so that means that the Forest Service can do whatever essentially they can do what they've said that they're going to do. And I don't know what that means for us and our lawsuit. We have a meeting, with the attorneys and the other 2 groups this afternoon to figure out what our next steps are, and I don't know what that is.
So here's what I would propose, and I don't need you to answer because your attorneys would be mad if you did. But I would love it if these groups that have come together to file this lawsuit somehow could drop it, but maybe work with my office, because some of the things, I'm serious, but some of the things that we've talked about, and take this back to the groups about trying to protect some of these larger growth trees, making sure that where there is management, fuel breaks, and even logging, taking a look at how that's done, but doing it in a responsible way where we can show that habitat long-term is being protected, but human life, too, is being protected as well as property.
the fisher's health and wellness is tied to humans' health and wellness. So they're the same. They're not in opposition to each other. And the question of logging, how much, what kind, is a really, like, you have to look at the details of these projects, and that's the struggle, right? We don't entirely know what they're doing, so we've dug through it, and we have to rely on what they're saying. But you go out in the field and you see that there's like big trees being logged, right? And then that is, what do you do with that? So, we're in the midst of the suit, mostly in regards to the fact that they're still out there logging those large trees, and that's the remaining fisher habitat. So anyway, I think that the human connection and the Pacific fisher connection are tied, and the health and wellness of those two are hinging upon each other. So again, the details, right? That's where the battle is.
Well, and I appreciate you taking the time to be here today, and we're gonna wrap up. And again, Deanna is the executive director of Unite the Parks, and she came down today to have this Facebook Live with all of us. I appreciate you doing that. And we will be back soon. Hopefully we can have some additional conversations in the future. My goal is, I hate lawsuits. I always want groups to come together, sit down, have a dialogue, and learn from each other and see if there's a way that we can work together. But you being here today means a lot to me. And for all of you that are out there, I would ask for you to share this on your Facebook page. Feel free to send questions, comments, anything you want to my office. If you need help with anything here in Fresno County, know that my office is available to you. But appreciate having the opportunity to serve you here in District 5, and we'll be back very soon with more updates.